to Yocha Dihi Winton Nation for sponsoring today's video. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Lunch with a Scientist. Today, we are joined by Raquel Silva. She is an environmental health scientist with a diverse background in environmental engineering, management, and policy. She holds a Ph.D. in environmental sciences and engineering from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her doctoral research involved global assessments of the impact of air pollution and climate change on human health. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and welcome Dr. Silva. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. And let's get started with an outline of what I'll be presenting to you today. So in this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little about my background, then I'll provide an overview of my doctoral and postdoctoral research, and finally, I'll talk about my current work as an environmental health scientist in a consulting firm. So I'm originally from Portugal, but I have lived in the US for over 15 years. Portugal, for those who may not know, is in the west coast of Europe. And now I live in the east coast of the US in Durham, North Carolina. Before college, I lived in a small town 50 miles north of Portugal's capital, Lisbon. I attended a middle school and most of my high school in a small secondary school in my hometown. But I did my senior year in a large high school in a nearby city. This allowed me to be better prepared for national exams and be admitted to my first choice for college. In college, I started as a chemistry major, but decided to change to environmental engineering. This was the best decision I could have made. I took the required math, chemistry, physics, and biology courses, which mostly were common to the chemistry major. But I also studied ecology, environmental management, environmental economics, impact assessment, and many other very interesting topics. My first job was as a high school teacher, but soon after I joined the civil engineering small company, and a few months later became involved in a big effort to implement a quality assurance system. Later, I became the quality management, and towards the end of my time there, I became the quality and environmental manager. I also supported the board of directors in strategic planning and decided to complete an MBA program. Finally, my career had a U-turn as I moved to the US with my family. This move was due to my husband's professional career, but ended up allowing me to do a PhD in environmental sciences and engineering at UNC Chapel Hill and become an environmental health scientist. So now I'll tell you a little bit about my doctoral research. My doctoral research focused on climate change, air quality, and health. This allowed me to learn more about health effects of air pollution and the interactions between air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and effects of air pollutants such as ground level ozone and fine particulate matter, and climate change. My doctoral research involved global assessments of the impact of air pollution and climate change on human health, including air quality modeling and spatial analysis. I worked on a few research projects and will highlight two. But first, let me tell you about the general methods I applied. So in this slide, you can see the different sources of data I used to estimate premature mortality due to air pollution at a global scale. First, I did air quality modeling, or I obtained fields from air quality modeling done by others. These allow me to get ozone and fine particulate matter, PM2.5, concentrations for base cases and control scenarios. Then I studied the literature and I used material from epidemiological studies to get the relative risk of death attributable to changes in pollutant concentrations. Using data from these two sources, I was able to estimate an attributable fraction, which means how much this air pollution contributes to death in a population. And using this attributable fraction and baseline mortality rates in those same populations, as well as the number of people living in a certain area, I was able to estimate premature mortality for that same area. I did these studies at a global scale. So I had to do a lot of programming. And I am not a programmer, but I had to learn how to code. And it wasn't really critical that I knew a specific language, although I did have to learn one. This, for example, is a snippet of IDL code. But it's really important to learn about coding principles. And through my doctoral program and postdoctoral research, I had to program both in IDL, as I mentioned, but also other languages like R and Python. I also had to learn how to work in MATLAB and how to work in ArcGIS. I actually used a lot of ArcGIS in my research to produce nice maps and to make some calculations in a spatial scale. So one of my projects, which was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is a really good peer-reviewed journal, was about the impact of individual anthropogenic emission sectors on the global burden of human mortality due to ambient air pollution. Anthropogenic means human-made. So this is basically looking into emissions caused by our activity as humans on and how these emissions impact mortality at a global scale. And here I presented you some results. I studied both the effect of ozone and fine particulate matter, but here these results are specific to fine particulate matter. And in order to do these studies, I consider the impact of these particulates on specific diseases like ischemic heart disease, which is the same as heart attacks or causes heart attacks, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease known as COPD, and lung cancer. So these are the types of diseases that are most impacted by air pollution from particulate matter. So these were the types of diseases that I considered to estimate mortality. And so I estimated global mortality for 5 emission sectors: energy, residential and commercial, industry, land transportation, shipping, and aviation. I used the global chemical transport model at a finer resolution than previous studies. This was very challenging. I can tell you that when I was doing the simulations at a global scale, they would take about 2.5 weeks to run on the computer cluster at UNC. So this is really a heavy model that takes a lot of computer resources. So the work does take some time because you have to run these simulations. Of course, this was a few years ago. Now with cloud computing, there are much more resources available, and this impacts heavily on how much work we can do and how quickly we can do that work. So as I said, I estimated mortality due to exposure to fine particulate matter from human origin. And this led me to estimate about 2.2 million deaths per year worldwide. More recent studies have even shown that the number is higher than this. So we were very conservative in our estimates. And when we conduct these estimates, we take into account uncertainty. And that's why I also indicate here the confidence interval for these mortality estimates. We do not estimate a precise number. We estimate an interval, and the mean of that interval is the estimate that we normally discuss. We also estimated that this highest mortality was in East Asia. So using a global chemical transport model and the methods that I mentioned before, I estimated that 2.2 million people die per year due to anthropogenic air pollution from these 5 sectors. Now, these estimates are actually conservative, but they provide us an interesting perspective that's important for policymaking. For example, we know that impacts are different in different regions of the world, and thus the policy and the controls that are needed in these different regions are different. And for example, if we look at North America, the impact of the energy sector and land transportation is much stronger than residential and commercial. However, if we look, for example, at Southeast Asia or even at East Asia, then the impact of residential and commercial combustion is much higher. And if you remember pictures from big India or China cities, you can understand why that pollution is really causing this high mortality in these regions. We also estimated anthropogenic ozone mortality, but this is much lower than that caused by fine particulate matter. And you should note that I keep saying we, because, you know, this was my doctoral research, but I was working with a group of people, and I had co-authors in this journal article. And in the next one that I'm going to show, I had many more co-authors, because for this other project where I looked at the mortality impact attributable to climate change, here I had many co-authors because we used an ensemble that is a group of global chemistry climate models, and these are the researchers conducting the modeling with those models. So I used data from they had gathered, and then with those air pollution data, I was able to estimate ozone-related mortality and fine particulate matter-related mortality. So considering a scenario of high emissions of greenhouse gases and their pollutants, I estimated that there could be an increase of 14% global ozone-related mortality, and also an increase in particulate matter-related mortality, which would counter an estimated decrease related to a decrease in emissions that's projected for the 21st century. So although emissions of fine particulate matter are projected to decrease in the 21st century, our estimates were that this decrease in emissions would actually be countered by an increase in particulate matter-related mortality due to climate change. So as you can see, these are very complex topics that require complex analysis and are difficult to synthesize. So it's very important that you write well and that you're able to communicate this research in meaningful ways, and you have much more impact if you are able to publish in well-regarded journals. So Nature Climate Change is one such journal, and I'm very honored that I was able, with my co-authors, to publish there. And the big lesson from this study was that climate change mitigation is likely to reduce air pollution-related mortality, and given these mortality impacts, it's really important that we reduce air pollution now and into the future. So now I'll tell you a little bit about my postdoctoral research. I switched gears entirely when I moved from my doctoral work to my postdoctoral research. As an ORISE postdoctoral fellow at the US Environmental Protection Agency, known as EPA, I conducted research on health and well-being benefits of natural environments. And this was really interesting work. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. I also integrated an EPA NIEHS interagency research team conducting a pilot study of exposure to chemicals in consumer products. This was a very small project, but it allowed me to learn a lot and actually impacted my career moving forward. But let's stay at my time as an ORISE postdoc at EPA. So I studied the benefits of nature to human health and well-being. Instead of thinking about just what it is like to be in nature, be it nature around you in the neighborhood, in nearby parks, or going to a big national park, we understand that it's not everyone experiences nature the same way. So my work was related with understanding what's the difference between just being in nature and how we experience nature and what affects that experience. So one important aspect to retain is that most of environmental health actually looks at the adverse effects of the environment on us. So we look at morbidity. Morbidity are impacts on health like hospitalization or missing work or missing school. And they relate with being sick but not dying. Mortality, as the name shows, is deaths related to, in this case, exposure to some pollutant or some factor in the environment that affects your health. Languishing means that you may not have a morbidity or mortality impact, but you still are not at your best in terms of your well-being. So we looked into the factors that are not leading to adverse effects, but instead are health promoting, are salutogenic. This means health promoting. So we looked at what contributes to healthiness, to longevity, to flourishing, to being the best you can be in terms of your individual well-being. And so with my mentors at EPA, we looked into this and we published a commentary explaining how we viewed all these aspects that affected the experience of nature in our to our well-being. So I did some data analysis for this work. And for that, what I did was I looked into residential greenness, so the amount of green space that exists close to your home. I looked at different covariates. There is different factors that can affect the relationship between exposure to natural environments and your individual well-being as an outcome. And these covariates can be demographics, such as your age, your sex. It can be also the socioeconomic status of your family or of your neighborhood. But it can also be many other characteristics, like, for example, being exposed to discrimination. It can be living in a place where there is low wealth, living in a place that suffered redlining in the past. So many aspects can influence your relationship with nature and can influence the impact nature has on your health and well-being. That was what we looked at. And we used data from nationwide studies such as this general social survey, but also some cohort studies like the sister study. Now I'll move to my current work. So currently I work for a global consulting firm called ICF. I joined ICF in 2018 as a lead health scientist. And as I mentioned before, actually having worked in that pilot study of exposure to chemicals in consumer products was really important to get me started at ICF. At ICF, I have managed and contributed to several projects where we provide support to the US EPA, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS, and other federal agencies and non-governmental clients. So I provide support to systematic literature reviews and data analysis related to human health risk assessment. Additionally, I have also supported the National Toxicology Program, managing the development of flagship reports on animal toxicology studies of different chemicals, and coordinating an international work group responsible for developing a tool for risk of bias assessment. And I'll tell you a little bit about what this risk of bias assessment means and why is it useful to have a tool to assess it. So let me walk you through some of my work. First, please note that what's here on the slide is not my work, but it provides you context for the work I do. It's also a resource you can use if you'd like to learn more about this topic. So here I show a graphic that's included in this report from the World Health Organization, which explains how you can use systematic review in chemical risk assessment. This is a very interesting report, and it provides you background, allowing you to understand why it is important to use systematic review when you are conducting risk assessments. Chemical risk assessments are one of the major topics of my work. So risk assessment starts with problem formulation, where you try to identify an hazard, for example, a chemical that's in the environment that people may be exposed to. Then you analyze exposures and you assess how humans are exposed to that chemical, for example. And finally, you characterize the risk involved in that exposure. In order to characterize both the hazard and to be able to derive those response calculations, you need to learn what the literature tells you about the effects of those chemicals. So the systematic review process also starts with problem formulation, so coming up with research questions that are meaningful to contribute to risk assessment in this case, although you can use systematic review for many different purposes. Here, this report focuses on the use of systematic review in chemical risk assessment. After developing a protocol that tells you how you're about to conduct the work to understand this problem, you identify which data you want to look at, and data here is in a broad sense. It's also just studies. What are the studies that you want to look into? You look at individual studies and you assess if they are really helpful to learn about the problem that you want to understand better. And then you have to synthesize and integrate all the evidence that you found in many different studies, and you have to understand how uncertain your results are. As I said, in science, hardly ever do we get to a very precise measure of risk or of hazard. We understand these impacts as an average and the confidence interval as embedded with uncertainty. And so when all this is done, we finally have to report on the work we did so that people can follow our methods and understand our results and the consequences, how they can apply those results for policy making and also for advocacy if it's an institution that conducts advocacy. So, as I mentioned, again, not showing my own work, but showing the work done by organizations such as the Environmental Protection Agency, which I now support as a contractor. So, looking at the work they've developed, they have this ORISE program that looks into identifying and characterizing the health hazards of chemicals found in the environment. And so I and many of my colleagues provide support to scientists at the US EPA so that they can conduct systematic reviews to support their ORISE assessments. And we mainly support them in a few of these different steps, and I'll highlight those steps. So we conduct literature search, screening, and inventory. So we conduct this in a systematic way to make sure that we really are aware of all the literature out there. And there are thousands and thousands of articles written. For example, in one of the projects I work for, and I will actually show a product from that project, we started with over 60,000 articles. And we had to go through a process of identifying which of those are actually important to answer our research questions. So this is what's entailed here in the literature search, screening, and inventory step. EPA had initially conducted this problem formulation step with scoping. They specified the assessment approach, and then they again ask for our help to conduct study evaluation. And this is where that risk of bias tool comes in. We look at different studies and we try to understand if these studies were well designed, well conducted, so they have robust methods and the methods were well applied, and the results are clear and presented in an unbiased way. There is what we are reading in the articles that were written corresponds to actually the findings they had. And sometimes there are ways that you are presenting truthful information, but you are just not presenting all of it. And that may bias the interpretation of those results. And then we also extract data from those studies so that those toxicity values can be derived. So these are three important steps that we provide currently support to EPA. We could also provide support on all the other aspects. It just depends on what our clients ask us to do. So these are three different products from the work I have been involved in since I joined ICF 4 years ago. For example, for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, I supported them managing the development of a report that was published on their website and is now available for any organization that wants to know about the toxicity of a chemical that I will call TSDM as an abbreviation. So these are complicated studies. They involve a lot of work from toxicologists and other scientists. And then, because these reports are going to be available for the public, they also need the work of people like like editors, like publication specialists, etc. So you can have the work of many different professionals to get one of these reports out, not just toxicologists. Then for the Environmental Protection Agency, we recently published a review article in a peer-reviewed journal, and I am one of the co-authors. And what I did was provide support to EPA, along with my colleagues, conducting all those stages of systematic literature review that I talked about before. And I also managed a team of external experts because, as I said, in order to prepare one such article, a lot of different specialists are involved, experts. And so we had several academic experts providing support to EPA. They are listed here. We had EPA staff scientists who were also involved in managing, and they designed the study, and then they are the ultimate people responsible for publishing it. And then there's all of us who supported this work, including myself, who was the project manager for preparing this work. And I also contributed with some work related with the respiratory effects of being exposed to PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyl mixtures. Another example, and this is my last one, is work we conducted for the American Lung Association. And here it was not a systematic review, but we did review available literature on the impacts of residential combustion in order to understand the health and environmental impacts of indoor residential combustion, which includes methane gas appliances, wood-burning stoves, and fireplaces, as mentioned here. This report is now available on ALA's website. So I hope this was interesting to show you a bit of my work. And if you would like to reach out, please feel free. This is my email address, and I'm happy to answer questions you may have or guide you through additional resources you may be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting to see all the cool things that you're doing. So we do have a research experience program that we run. And one of the things that we talk to students about is avoiding bias. So you can maybe give them a little bit of advice for when they're designing their methods and looking at their data, how to avoid that piece.
Yes, risk of bias is a very important thing to take into account when you are evaluating a study. It's important to account for potential for bias when you are designing your studies. So, as you can see here in this figure, this provides an overview of how a study is evaluated in the IRIS assessment. And what you can see here is that different domains are looked into each study, and then the study is rated in terms of how much confidence we have in it. So if you're looking at an epidemiology study, there is a study done in humans, then you look at the way exposure was measured. So when you're designing the study, you have to take into account how are you measuring exposure so that your results correspond to what you are really measuring. It also looks into how you evaluate outcomes. So how do you establish methods that allow you to make sure your outcomes that you have evaluated really correspond to the relationships that exist between exposure and outcome. A very important point is participant selection. So when you are selecting participants to a study, you have to make sure you do not select a convenience sample, and then your results will not be generalizable to the whole population. You also have to take into account factors that may interfere with the relationships you're looking into. And that's what you're thinking about when you're talking about confounding. We also need to take into account the methods for data analysis. Some methods will, for example, lead to taking out data that may actually be important, but maybe you didn't have complete data. So then you have techniques to account for the data that you could not use. This is just an example, of course. You also have to be careful about how you select your results to report on them. Basically, you cannot be selective about them. You have to report your results so that what you're telling your audience is really what you found. For example, some people think, oh, I'm not going to tell about non-existence of a relationship, what we call null results. Those are not so interesting. I'm not going to report on those. That's really going to introduce bias, because it would make it seem like what you found is really what's in the full picture when you're actually selecting a little bit of that picture. And finally, you have to be careful to have a big enough sample, to have questions that really respond to your research question in a way that your results are robust. And that's what is meant here by looking into sensitivity. Are your results robust, or could they be just a matter of chance? For animal studies, you also look into several of these domains, and you also look at things like how was the chemical administered to the animal that is being, or to the group of animals that are being studied. You also have to take into account things like, did the animals die because of exposure? If they did, do you still have enough of a sample to come up with conclusions? So there's different factors that you have to take into account when you are designing your study to make sure that your final results are actually representative and generalizable. And the same applies to in vitro studies, so studies done directly in cell cultures. And there are also now in silico studies. So people are doing simulations just using computer models. Normally, those studies are also supportive of animal in vitro and epidemiology studies. So all these studies need to be designed, conducted, the results analyzed and reported in a way that what you are telling your audience corresponds to what was found, and what was found was not determined by the specific people or the specific animals that were used to conduct the study, but it's really generalizable to a certain population. I hope this is helpful. And again, if you need additional information, I'm happy to try to find additional resources.
Thank you. Yes, that's one of the things I think students have a really hard time understanding, because it's very easy to throw bias in unintentionally. So that was going to be very helpful for our research students in our programs, because you explained it very well. And I think it will drive the point home is just include it all. That's science, right? Sometimes things just don't work out how we think they might work out. And that's all part of it. We learn from it. We ask more questions and continue that data.
I honestly, for me, that's one of the lessons I learned right from my doctoral research, was how important uncertainty is, and how important it would be to have a population at large that has much higher environmental health literacy, so that they could understand the issue of uncertainty. People think science gives them, immediate answers, and that science doesn't change. Like, you get to a result, that result is never going to change. And science is kind of the opposite of that. If you learn more, something that you had concluded a while back will change. And that's not bad. It's just our knowledge evolving. But I think because in the population at large, science literacy, and especially environmental health literacy, is actually low, unfortunately, people have a hard time understanding this issue of uncertainty. And that is especially, I think, critical for climate change research. Because if you're doing projections, there are so many uncertain variables. I mean, when I was doing the work I talked about, I didn't talk about this, but this is quite important. First, it was very hard to find projections of population at a global scale that went into the future so as much as we needed them to go. Even worse, getting baseline mortality. So I had to reach out to the World Health Organization and also folks at the University of Washington, because they have the best resources. But until we know which ones are the best, you're there like navigating all the deluge of data that's out there, but it's sometimes really not meaningful. And so it's hard to tell. I feel like that is the most important role of our academia, is really to allow us to separate what's good and what's not good by educating us all. So if we're all educating, not only the students who actually go to a university, but also the general population, that's critical. And my current work is involving more and more what are called environmental justice communities. So communities that have been heavily burdened by environmental impacts from, for example, chemical exposures. They may live near a landfill, or they may live near an industrial complex, or near a road. And these communities many times really need information to come to them in a way that they can understand it, because they should not be recipients of support. They should be co-creators of that support. So in order to create something, you need to know what you're creating and how you can create it, right? So I feel like that's our role as students and as scientists and professionals later on, is really to make use of all we learned and be able and try, and I'm always learning about this, but try to communicate it better so that everyone can have access, not just the few that were privileged enough to study more about a certain topic.
That is amazing advice, and thank you so much. So if you would like to do your own research, we do, like I said, have a research experience program. So if you're interested, the information is right here. It's also available on our website, and you can always email me at jen@headwaterscienceinstitute.org. So I just wanted to thank you again, Raquel, for meeting with us and sharing all of your amazing research and that wonderful advice you just gave for our students.
I also would want to tell everyone that it's very important to be involved in the community at large. And from my perspective, I do it by being an active member of the American Public Health Association. Having studied at UNC Chapel Hill in the School of Public Health became very near and dear to me. And when I was able to join APHA, I found really a home with other scientists and advocacy people. I don't conduct advocacy because of the work I do for federal clients, but I support others who do, of course. And my science, I hope, will help them conduct their advocacy. And the other thing I also do, only from a perspective of education, is being a Climate for Health ambassador for Eco America. Again, they do a lot of advocacy. I don't, but I think by educating, I can also do my little bit.
Oh, I love that. So just networking and using, helping each other out as one community in science. Again, yeah, this is so important. So thank you again so much. And I will be sharing some curriculum to go along with this talk. So make sure you click below and you can go ahead and see all of the cool information that we have to share. So thank you again, Dr. Silva, for taking the time to meet with us.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye. Want to learn more about our Lunch with the Scientist program? Make sure to like and subscribe and visit us online at www.headwaterscienceinstitute.org for a full list of our video library and curriculum.